But yeah, everyone, this is Simon Evans, who has been described as, well, first of all, he's a comedian, stand-up comedian, lots of radio shows and TV appearances as well. He's been described as a right-wing comedian. Sorry, actually, the right-wing comedian was, I think one of the headlines that I saw. So that's quite a title. We can talk a little bit more about that later. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about sort of free speech in comedy and sort of the state of comedy at the moment and various sort of issues relating to that. So yeah, Simon, if you'd like to just say a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, exactly what you said is true. I've been a stand-up comedian since 1996. I've performed in pretty much every comedy club up and down the country and overseas as well. I've done about 7 or 8 full-length shows at the Edinburgh Fringe and then toured those around the country. I do quite a lot of corporate work when we aren't under pandemic conditions, host dinners and events of that kind. And then I also present and write radio programs, in particular Simon Evans Goes to Market, which is a sort of economics and comedy mashup, hopefully funnier than it would perhaps sound, but also informative. We've done 5 series of that. I think that might be as many as we're going to do under that name, but a new series is commissioned for next year, which is broadly speaking in the same territory. So that's been very rewarding. I'm also occasionally on the news quiz on Radio 4 and 1 or 2 other sort of Radio 4 panel games. And I write for various online magazines as well, like Spectator Life and Unheard and a few other commentary type mags. And I think that pretty much accounts for most of my time. I'm also married with 2 children, Edward and Matilda, who are in their mid-teens. Sorry, there's a door slamming there. I'm just going to address that in case it carries on.
Okie dokie.
Yeah, that's all good. And yeah, unless there's anything else you'd like to know, that's pretty much the broad CV. And yes, also, I suppose to address, I know if you want to come onto it, I've never really thought of myself as a right-wing comedian, insofar as I never really thought of myself as political, but to the extent that I have some sympathy with Brexit voters, to the extent that I have some sympathy with people who are exasperated by some of the demands and preoccupations of what I think of as the new left, the kind of radical left, the progressive left, the woke left, that kind of stuff. And I've spoken out against that more on Twitter than on stage, really. It's not the sort of thing that I tend to address in my stand-up comedy, because to be honest, it's not something that most people in most comedy audiences are very much aware of one way or the other. But online, it seems to be quite a hot topic. And I have been sort of identified as somebody who is skeptical about some of the direction of travel that is being foisted upon us from academia and I think to some extent the media and so on as well. So yeah, we can talk about that.
Nice. Well, you basically covered my first point about addressing people's claims that you're a right-wing comedian. But so first off, I think I'll talk a little bit about free speech as it relates to comedy. Especially seeing as everything's going on in the world at the moment. We've kind of got Black Lives Matter, and sort of like, I think the tone around certain issues has changed a lot because of that. So I was just going to ask you if you think there are any areas or subjects that sort of shouldn't be joked about at all.
Shouldn't be joked about. It depends on the context to some extent. I'm not, I suppose you might say, an absolutist or a purist. I think you have to use a certain amount of common sense, you might call it, or sensibility or sensitivity to a situation. If I were at a funeral, I wouldn't, tell sick jokes about the recently deceased, to their bereaved. There's some kind of sense of where you are and what the context is. But I think you have to be very careful about establishing legislation to prevent that kind of. I think it's much more important to encourage people to develop their own sense of, you know, a code of behavior which is appropriate and which enables you to be a human being able to participate in society. And if society decides that it's not enjoying your contributions, then it's perfectly entitled to shun you, you know. But that's a very different matter to either national legislation, state legislation, you know, actual statute, to deny people the right to joke or debate or, you know, express certain opinions. And it's very different as well in the context of your surroundings to say, on the one hand, if somebody were to be forever making appalling and offensive jokes in the refectory, you know, and then found themselves without partners to enjoy their lunch with, I don't think anyone would feel anything wrong had happened. That's very different from threatening violence if people whose views you don't like are invited to address students who do share those views, or at least are interested to hear them. That's a very, very different business. And the second one of those examples, I don't think anyone should be entitled to prevent. I think I would certainly have a very high bar for proof that somebody shouldn't be allowed onto a campus to give their views. And in terms of joking, if you're a comedian, you know, it's very much a question of what the joke is and how funny is it. If it's not very funny, then you won't last very long as a comedian. Comedians exist, an almost perfect example of the free market. They are subject to very swift and decisive mechanisms that let them know if their material is not working. And if the material is funny enough, somebody like Frankie Boyle, for instance, who for a long time was just straightforwardly offensive and has now sort of discovered a sort of moral dimension to his work, he would get away with it because it was extremely funny. And it was as sick as you could imagine. And a lot of people, such as my parents, would have been offended, you know, when he made jokes about the Queen's pussy being haunted and that sort of stuff. I found it a little bit grating, to be honest, because I'm a little bit conservative, perhaps, in terms of what I think, you know. But the joke was funny, and so he got away with it. He was still on BBC primetime.
Well, I ask, and just kind of latched onto what you said there about like the difference between you were talking about comedians as a perfect example of the free market and letting sort of people decide whether someone's funny or not. But going back to what you were saying about legislation and stuff, I just wondered if you were aware of the case of the chap in Scotland who, the one who taught his dog to do a Nazi salute. Yeah, so I was just wondering what you thought about that whole situation.
I would say this before I give my opinion on it. I thought it was a very, what you might call sui generis situation, which is to say it was in many respects quite unique. I didn't feel that it taught us a great deal that was very useful about society in general or about comedy in general. He wasn't a professional comedian. He's not a professional comedian. He was somebody who was creating content, I think, on YouTube, pretty much for his own amusement and for a small group of subscribers, of followers who understood the context, which was that the pug, for people who don't know it, had been trained to give a Nazi salute with its paw, and the signal for him that he would give to this pug in order to make it do this, he would say, "Gas the Jews. Do you want to gas the Jews? Do you want to gas the Jews?" And the pug had learned to respond to this with a Nazi salute. But he claimed, and I think with some plausibility, that he didn't do it because he hates the Jews or because he wants to relish their discomfort in being reminded of the Holocaust. He did it because his wife, or his girlfriend rather, was forever going on about how cute her dog was, and this had infuriated him. And so he wanted to make the dog be as repellent and repugnant, actually a repugnant pug, as could conceivably be possible. And so in a sense, he was acknowledging and admitting and agreeing with the idea that to have a Nazi pug that was trained to respond to Holocaust references of that kind was a repellent and hideous thing. But it would have been understood within the context of his YouTube subscriber base. It then leaked out, and I believe it was pretty much a sort of private prosecution, which was led by a Jewish pressure group who just found this sort of thing completely beyond the pale. Now, I personally felt that no, he shouldn't have been fined. He certainly should. I think he was threatened with prison, and there was a fine he had to pay he hadn't paid it, he would have gone to prison. And it was quite substantial. I think he then launched a GoFundMe, if I remember rightly, and got more than enough money to pay. This is what happens in these things at the moment. You know, it all spins off into online social media content. And he achieved a degree of notoriety, and he actually became a UKIP candidate, if I remember rightly, at the last.
That's true, yeah.
It was all rather bizarre. UKIP had about half a dozen sort of bizarre candidates, including Sargon of Akkad, or I think his name is, who's a
he's come on our campus actually.
He's a sort of Gamergate commentator who then became. He's a very intelligent, well-informed guy, but I personally find him a rather grating individual. But you know, he had interesting things to say, but of course the mass media essentially presented him as somebody who had once threatened Jess Phillips with rape, which again was a distortion of the truth. But this is what happens when people break through from sort of YouTube cult level fame into ITV level fame. They are judged standards, and the mass media, the news media, are very able to identify a single point of information which they will use to characterize your entire position. Nazi pug man had no capacity to escape his Nazi pug origins, and he was essentially seen as a one-joke shot, which may or may not be true. I've never met the guy. He didn't look to me like somebody I particularly get on with, but you know, I do think you have to set a very high bar for freedom of speech, and I would have been inclined not to persecute him. But it was interesting, more interesting really, to see how my industry, my fellow comedians, came down on that. A large number of them, I think, were rather disappointingly inclined to just throw him under the bus. I think there was much less sense of urgency or loyalty because he wasn't a professional comedian, possibly. But nevertheless, one would have hoped that anyone would have said, come on, you know, this is a joke. It may be a silly joke. It may be a sick joke. It may be offensive to you, but nobody is forcing you to watch it. And certainly nobody is suggesting this is actually going to encourage any kind of anti-Semitic, you know, violence or even really thought, I wouldn't say. In fact, if anything, it kind of, you know, it was the sort of joke I used to make with my best mate at school, Ross Cohen, you know, who was obviously Jewish. And we used to joke about which teachers look more like Himmler and which ones look more like Goebbels. Do you know what I mean? It was like, just, you know, this is part of our folklore now, the Nazis and how they are. It's like something of the Grimm brothers. So that for me was kind of ridiculous. But there we are.
Of course, the counterpoint to that sort of defense would be that the very fact that it was a Jewish pressure group that I think was sort of leading the charge against him, I think. A lot of people I saw saying around that was, you don't know how someone else might be affected by this. Someone with a different life experience than you might be affected by a joke that you make. So if you can't possibly understand sort of the life experience of these people and how they might take it, you don't have the right to make that joke in the first place.
Well, to me, that's self-evidently nonsense. If you can make a joke and somebody can demonstrate that it had an actual effect on them, you know, if you made a joke that was actually turned out to have the effect of being incitement to violence, if you made a joke and as a result somebody outside the theatre that night was stabbed, and you can trace the course of events, then I think you can perfectly reasonably say, well, listen, you can't make that joke because it's creating a cause and effect, a chain of causation, which is unacceptable. But if you're saying to somebody, I am telling a joke, and somebody out there is finding that joke so offensive that they wish to take court action, but it's simply a matter of them taking offense, then no, there is nothing. There is nothing in common law, or as far as I'm concerned, in statute, and I think philosophically I would defend this position, that entitles you to shut down a conversation or an avenue of inquiry or a topic of humour. I could tell jokes, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't last very long, but I could tell jokes about Harold Shipman, I could tell jokes about Jimmy Savile. Lots of people tell jokes about Jimmy Savile. To be honest, there are people walking around in Britain today whose children were raped by Jimmy Savile, and yet Jimmy Savile is joked about still frequently. You know, it's an horrific series of events. And it triggered all kinds of ludicrously sort of after the event retaliation from the police attempting to demonstrate their rigor by arresting people for footling sort of tiny misdemeanors that, by comparison with Savile's, legacy, were of absurdly minute proportions, because he had basically got away with 30 years of making an absolute fool of the establishment and the police and all the rest of it. But there are people still walking around today who lived through that, and yet Savile is perfectly acceptable as a joking.
That's true.
The reality is the Holocaust, terrible though it was, is an historic event now. It took place in the Second World War. My father is 90 years of age. He was 14 when the Second World War came to an end. I'm not saying there's nobody who was personally involved in it now, but these things move backwards in time. The Armenian genocide, which took place in the First World War and is still denied by the Turkish government, it took over 1 million Armenian lives and was perpetrated with every bit as much sadistic and inhumane singularity of purpose by the Turkish authorities, the Ottoman authorities as they were at that time. Is not protected by any laws whatsoever. Nobody discusses to any degree whatsoever whether or not that's an acceptable subject for humor. So yeah, that's my view. I would say I don't have any inclination to make Holocaust jokes or to make any kind of humorous capital out of people's misery generally. It's not my cup of tea. But if you're going to make jokes about the Iraq War, or if you're going to make jokes about Vietnam, you know what I mean? They bombed villages with napalm. The Holocaust is not a uniquely horrific event in human history or even in my lifetime. So I don't believe that it's a good practice to redline in that respect.
You talked a little bit earlier about sort of when Count Dankula became a UKIP candidate. You talked about sort of the way the media, he was sort of treated in the media, and I think you mentioned Sargon of Akkad as well. Would you say sort of British media in general is sort of biased against the right wing at the moment? And I don't necessarily mean just in news, but in sort of like the entertainment side of things as well, like more your sort of sphere. Would you say it's biased more towards the left or against the right in that sense?
I think in BBC comedy terms, there's quite a lot of bias. I would say there's a strong left-wing bias, progressive bias. When you say, the trouble with terms like left and right, of course, they are quite old-fashioned. Left and right come from the French Revolution, you probably know, and it's very much, I think, of an economic terms. Do you want to redistribute wealth, or do you want to allow private property to take its course? And those aren't really the issues anymore. It's much more to do with sort of social issues, whether you want to acknowledge the equality of different lifestyle choices and so on. And I think there is a progressive bias in two respects. Firstly, I think what I think of as probably the comedy industry to some extent anyway does throw up a large number of stand-up comedians do tend to be more, let's say, Remain orientated, not necessarily, very progressive, but just more kind of that, like collectivist in that respect. And or at least the ones who seem to get on TV are more. But it's a term I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, but it does seem to be the most useful one. The gatekeepers within BBC, the producers, the talent scouts, that kind of thing. The people who are creating the programs have that kind of mindset. I don't think it goes challenged very often, in the same way that, the anthropology department in most universities is like over 90% left wing now. In America, there are, I think, something like less than 1 in 30 tenured professors in humanities are registered Republicans. They don't encounter the other point of view. It becomes accepted as being absurd and lunatic and not worth consideration. It's constantly strawmanned by their own conversations, and they don't realize the extent to which it's being excluded. And the extent, the famous old saying is, the assumptions are the things you don't realize you're making. So they don't see it as biased at all. It's not a deliberate attempt to keep people out. This is just their world. And obviously the figure of fun in any conversation about politics is going to be Donald Trump. Obviously it's going to be Boris Johnson. And nobody thinks, well, maybe there is a reason why Donald Trump was selected out of, a whole field of different candidates for the Republican Party and then against Hillary Clinton. They aren't really interested in exploring what was so totally wrong with the American political system that was on offer prior to Trump that people threw their lot in with him.
I think
in the comedy scene. Yeah, to answer your question, I don't think the whole of media is quite as biased in the same way, but I do think it is generally. I think the BBC generally attracts now increasingly left-wing people and has done probably for the last 10 or 20 years. I think you kind of see it in most of the production departments. And I think, truthfully, most people who are more right-wing orientated and who have an interest in pursuing a career in media, I mean, obviously, if you want to get into print media now, that's brave. You're backing a dying horse, really. So, that's quite difficult. So most people who are more right-wing or more right-orientated, conservative or reactionary, or you might find sort of more, they think of themselves as quite punk, some of them, quite anti-establishment in their views, might very easily become YouTube creators, or they might very easily just set up their own podcast, or they might be drawn towards things like Times Radio, or they might go towards Sky. There are lots of different avenues now where you can find the opportunity to express yourself and make content and make some money, and you won't necessarily find that you have as warm a welcome within some of the bigger institutions as you might find that if you go rogue. So in a sense, even though it sounds absurd, I think there is some truth to the idea that right-wing media is the new punk, because they're actually the ones who are being forced to look outside the major labels.
So there's this I think you kind of touched on it just there, that the people don't quite sort of realize that they're being these gatekeepers, as you put it. There's this idea that's kind of floated around, I think, in more right-wing circles as an accusation. It's this idea of the long march through the institutions, and the idea that the institutions, sort of media and things like this, are becoming more, I guess, progressive is more accurate than left-wing, because the idea is, I guess, that you can't. Revolution isn't the way to provide these kind of ideas anymore, and. Yeah. Kind of being these sort of institutions that control public opinion or control the views of public opinion is the better way of doing that. And a lot of people sort of paint that as a sort of conspiracy theory, but I just ask for your take on that.
Well, it does sound like one, doesn't it? Except that the term "the long march through the institutions" was coined by a cultural Marxist, Rudi Deutsch, I think his name was, in the 1960s. He himself was a scholar of his name escapes me now. The guy who was in jail, spent the 1930s in jail at the hands of Mussolini and died there. Little Marxist writer. Oh, that's annoying. I can't remember his name. That will come back to me. I'll remember it in a minute. But that was a posited idea. How it would be organised, how it would be orchestrated, I mean, without it being a conspiracy theory, does sound absurd. I agree. But the proposition was, yes, essentially that the level of wealth and the level of comfort and the level of the sort of settled establishment, really, in the West were too comfortable for traditional Marxist appeals to work, that most people would not want to go through what they had seen blazing across Russia in the 1920s.
Yeah.
In order to see a fair distribution of wealth, if they thought it might be morally justifiable. And so they had long discussions about this, about what might happen. And, a lot of these kind of theories were to get overlapped and muddled to some extent: postmodernism, cultural relativism, cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School. You can read into all these things and see which sort of strands of thought you recognize in kind of modern wave. And I think there is, to some extent, some legitimacy to the argument that cultural Marxism and postmodernism are anathema to one another, in the sense that Marxism does at least acknowledge a hierarchy of values, and postmodernism says that there is no such thing as fundamental truth. So those two things shouldn't really be able to coexist in a single movement. But Deutsch, anyway, and other people did agree that I'm going to have to sort of look him up. Sorry, it's at the back of my mind, tickling my mind, who this guy was. Italian Marxist.
I think somebody might have put it in the
yeah. That's his name, yeah. So he's the first guy you want to read about this sort of thinking. But essentially the proposition was, we will never overcome the hegemony. This was his term, which you hear a lot now. We will overcome down the hegemony of the West. The West's ideals are propositioned to you all the time. You know, the television, Hollywood itself, of course, which nowadays a lot of right-wingers regard as a nest of progressive ideals. Hollywood then was very strong in propagating right-wing ideals, conservative values, go off to war to fight the fascists, and then come home and be a company man. You know, James Stewart, Jack Lemmon, those kind of movies, very, very solid, supportive of traditional American values, or what they thought of as American values. Anyway, these are very interesting sort of fibers that weave together, but it's a huge conversation to try and understand how they might have changed. I don't think there was any organized, or certainly centrally organized, attempt at a long march through the institutions. But gradually, over the course of the last 20 years, a lot of institutions which were once quite solidly right-wing and conservative and establishment type, and basically once you got in, you didn't want to rock the boat, and you just sat there and waited for your pension to arrive, and you propagated, you know, certain fairly reliable, stable ideas about how society should be run and what hierarchies look like and what men should do and what women should do and whose job it was to look after the children. All those kind of ideas that were, you know, that Gramsci found objectionable and wanted to overturn, but realized you couldn't do that by marching through the streets with flaming torches. So you had to do the hard yards. You had to get into those institutions, wear a certain tie, brush your nails, and show up at work every day looking smart and presentable, and gradually undermine the traditional values that supported those places. And now I think you will see that. You know, now you will see an awful lot of places, whether it be like the museum sector, or whether it be academia, or whether it be the big broadcasting institutions, or even, you know, Goldman Sachs, to some extent. You know, woke capital is a thing. You know, it exists. Now, I have a view about woke capital that it is largely there to distract you from the economic realities, which are actually causing everyone all the trouble, actually causing the woe, you know, is the massive tendency, as judged by Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century, you know, where he very deftly and I think, you know, unassailably argues that in the long run, capital accrues value faster than you can earn it through your labor. And gradually, you know, wealth becomes unassailable, and wealth has gone more and more in the last 10 years, certainly post the big crash in 2008, wealth has gone more and more to the wealthy. Almost all the increase in productivity, almost all the increase in earnings has gone to the top 1%. A lot of people, not just like students, not just people who can't afford a flat, but even like headmasters and editors of local newspapers are not seeing any improvement in their lifestyle. And this is creating an awful lot social pressure. You know, this is creating a lot of unrest and tension. And rather than address the economic problems and the inequities and accept that perhaps certain changes in the tax code or whatever might be you know, a good idea to solve this, they would rather have you believe that it's because trans people are being bullied by J.K. Rowling, you know, because that's a much less dangerous threat to their own situation.
So is this kind of like throwing people off the scent almost?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. And looking like you're with the program and you're a friend of the young and you want to stay with it, you know, without actually addressing the situation, the serious problems that those people are facing. But it's a very different, I mean, a lot of people have said, is this like 1968, you know, the year of student revolt in Paris, and of course in America, and you had Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy being assassinated, and there were riots and civil rights and so on. People have said it goes back to that. But during that time, you did not have Goldman Sachs with Black Lives Matter on their website. You know,
No, it's true.
Very different.
I just wanted to go back to something you said earlier.
Sorry, that door's banging again. I'm going to try and sort it again. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. I think it's done this time.
Cool. I just want to go back to what you said earlier. I really like what you said about sort of comedy is like the sort of perfect example of the free market. So if the sort of if we took like the BBC for example, if we say the BBC has a sort of progressive bias in sort of the entertainment industry or media in general, do you think that kind of hurts comedy in any way? Because there's this idea of sort of get woke, go broke, and it's like this pattern that people have seen of if you try and do, like you were saying with Goldman Sachs, if you're trying to sort of pander to this kind of thing, eventually there's a reaction and you won't see returns from it. Do you think this kind of sort of bias or sort of leaning like hurts comedy as a whole?
It's a very tricky thing to say what might hurt comedy. I mean, I think that might be a confusion of terms altogether. I don't think you're likely to get the best and sharpest comedy when it's unchecked, when it's unthreatened or unopposed in that respect, but that's not really quite so much my problem with it. I think if you want to create an alternative voice, if you have a different point of view and you want to create comedy that is skeptical of woke politics, then to a degree, that environment is being created by the tension that's building, by the more and more people who are frustrated and impatient and exhausted by it all. What I do think it is hurting is the BBC, though, because the BBC are increasingly having to defend their position anyway. They are no longer taken for granted. We're all aware that there are different pricing models and there are different fee-raising models, and people are discussing a subscription model and so on. And I think in order to remain viable and to be able to justify what is, in a sense, a tax that has to be collected with coercion. I mean, just like any other tax, you have to have the ability to say, if you don't pay your license fee, you will be in trouble, because otherwise people know who's going to pay it, So if you want to have that level of leverage and coercion, then I think you have to represent the spectrum of views in Britain. And I think if half of the license fee payers in Britain are just starting to feel that they just don't see their views presented fairly or addressed fairly, they just constantly see themselves strawmanned. If all they ever see is jokes about Nigel Farage being a civilized golf club racist, and that's what everyone who voted Brexit is essentially sort of tarred with that brush, then I think they start to lose their legitimacy as the national broadcaster. And I think that is a problem, and then from that, comedy will suffer, because the one thing that the BBC has always been brilliant at, and to some extent, it still holds true to some extent, is that they have the capacity to invest long-term, and comedy does sometimes need nurturing. The vast majority of great sitcoms that this country grew to love, from Dad's Army, Steptoe and Son, Only Fools and Horses, all the way through 40 Towers, The Office. The Office is a great example. Very hard to imagine that ever getting a toehold on ITV1. They would not have been brave enough to confuse people that much. Most people watching The Office the first time it came out, this is probably like history to most of you, I still think of it as quite new, but I think this was about 2003. When The Office first came out, a lot of people honestly didn't quite know whether it was a sitcom or was a genuine documentary, with David Brent being somebody who was so hideously unself-aware, he honestly didn't know how funny it was. That nerve to make programming like that. And that is something the BBC do. And what they've discovered is that, generally speaking, they get better viewing figures when the first series of a sitcom is repeated than they did the first time around. It takes a while to bed in. And something that doesn't have to justify every single program with advertising revenue right there and then, can afford to take chances like that. And that's been very valuable for British comedy over the years. But the other thing it's always done, the BBC, always did to some extent, was it was a bit of an old boys network. I can see why that annoyed some people, but the truth was, a lot of people were given jobs because they've been up at Oxford with the producer, or somebody. I know this chap, he was terribly funny, John Cleese, his name is, let's get him in. Now John Cleese is a comedy, and it worked, But on the other hand, you can see why the system might, on paper look wrong and be not defensible.
Just going back to what you said earlier about Brexit, I was wondering if you kind of thought that sort of there were certain kind of ideas that came out around Brexit. I think it's obviously quite a divisive issue. Do you think a lot of the kind of, how best to put this, the sort of characterization of sort of Brexit voters you said earlier that you kind of sympathise with them to an extent. So did you think that was sort of fair at all, or wildly overblown?
Sorry, what their representation?
Yeah.
Well, it just seemed to be relentless, I suppose, as much as anything else. I mean, watching certain TV shows, Mock the Week would be an obvious one. Every week, you were invited to laugh at their knuckle-dragging, pig-headed failure to grasp the subtleties of the issues, that they were all just racists. And I knew, for instance, that my father intended to vote Brexit, and I knew that he had voted to remain in the European Economic Community in 1975. He took part in that referendum and was an enthusiastic participant in what he had understood to be a trading arrangement, and he felt that it was progressing too much into a political union. He didn't like the direction of travel, and he thought this was going to be his last chance to put the brakes on. I mean, I don't want to overstate the fact, he was 88 when he made that vote. Possibly in some conversations, some people might find some of his views outdated, but there's certainly no malice in it. It wasn't like a sort of hate-filled tirade kind of vote. He just felt, no, that's probably far enough. And if we're not able to renegotiate terms that would be more appropriate to what I want from the EU, then I'd rather we were out. I just never saw that point of view presented in comedy or acknowledged as even viable or feasible. Everyone who voted Brexit presented inevitably as either a dupe or just an out-and-out racist, somebody who either hadn't understood what was being, proposed, or somebody who had understood it all too well and couldn't wait to start daubing swastikas on the Polish delicatessen, even though that was obviously the most ironic sort of thing you could possibly do. So there was just this kind of, I just felt tired of it. And I don't mind that from any one comedian or any two or three comedians, but when you've got a show which has 6 comedians on every week and you never once see the other side positioned, then after a while it gets tiresome. And so I sort of felt like coming to their defense a little bit, even though, I mean, I said, my wife put it very clearly for us. She said, I wish to maintain freedom of movement. I wish to be able to visit other countries in Europe and live there and even work there if I want to. I want that for my children. And if that means I have to put up with having cheap builders and cheap childcare when I'm living in the UK as well, so be it, which was a kind of ironic and quite well-praised sort of middle-class position. And that was my position as well, to be honest. I'd almost overwhelmingly benefited from the EU. I was one of those people who could only experience upsides, really. There was the occasional moment where you might feel some of the character, perhaps, of Britain was draining away a bit, but those things are often illusory anyway, and you just don't know what might be the underlying causes of them. But as I say, I just thought, well, this is a democracy, and it's quite rare, actually, that people really do get to make a vote that makes a decisive difference. Normally they vote for a party, and then there are so many compromises in legislation that they attempt to make that you have very little direct contact with the outcome of your vote. But this is an occasion where they decided once every 40 years you will actually get to have a say in the long-term direction of the country, and they had made their call. People had long enough, they'd had plenty of time to try and communicate how important it was that we continue cross-national collaboration with academia and scientific inquiry and all the rest of it. And they'd just taken it for granted. They had arrogantly assumed that these people would just do as they were told, and they got fucked over. And I kind of enjoyed that to some extent, to be honest. And I think the reaction of the political classes afterwards was absolutely disgraceful, and comedians never once held them to account for it. They were instead absolutely collusional in it. They colluded with the same disgraceful response, which was, oh, you didn't really mean it. You didn't understand. Oh, it was Russian money. Oh, it was Aaron Banks's millions. Oh, it was Facebook algorithms. You can't possibly have really. No, they meant it. They don't want to be in it anymore. Disgraceful. And they've been completely abandoned by the political classes until Boris Johnson came along. They were just being driven into a ditch, and there was hardly a comedian or any kind of cultural commentator at all outside of a few newspapers and magazines who was willing to stand up for them and say, they have told you what they want. This happens every so often. Now you fucking well pay attention.
It does seem very difficult to sort of hold the media to account at the moment. I just remember just you talking just then reminded me of the I don't know if you know about the Covington Catholic school kids. I think that was last year.
I mentioned them on the podcast I did, funny enough, with trigonometry. Yeah.
Oh, it's Konstantin Kisin, isn't it?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, yeah, we met him about a year ago, I think. But they're just the kind of the treatment that they got, which could very much have been put down to sort of a biased misunderstanding.
Yeah.
But afterwards, when for those of you who don't know, just there was this misunderstanding that it appeared happened over in the US, where a bunch of kids wearing MAGA hats were a video came out of them sort of smiling smugly at some Native American protesters, and it was painted in the media as sort of MAGA kids bully Native American protesters.
Native American, he was a political activist, but he wasn't immediately recognised in this country anyway. And he was standing there, sort of beating his drum like a tambour and chanting. And there was a Catholic schoolboy in a MAGA hat, face to face with him, only a few inches away, apparently smiling at him in this sort of goading manner. And it did, to me, when I first saw it, I thought that's terrible. He's like got in that in poor old man's face, and he's just trying to do his Native American dance, whatever, and this kid is like mocking him. And then you discover it's exactly the other way around. The Native American has marched into this gaggle of kids and is provocatively drumming right in their faces. And the kid has all he's done is stood his ground. And as it emerged what the truth was, and longer video evidence came out, and there was a third party involved who I can't remember what they called, something like the original Hebrews or something. They're a group who present themselves as the 13th tribe or something. It's all quite sort of complex and biblical, but they're very provocative, and they deliberately try and stir up trouble. And there was footage of them doing that, calling, filthy terms and so on, to try and undermine and get these kids riled up and so on. And these kids were just on a day trip and had been on a bit of a stroll around. It was appalling how they were presented. But the thing was, you could understand how the initial footage had been misunderstood, and I wouldn't blame anyone in the modern world for posting a tweet going, oh, this kid's misbehaving, because that's how we all overreact, easily done. But nobody would back down. Nobody backed down. It became obvious what had happened. And no individual, and none of the New York Times, the Washington Post, they all continued to present this story as being, we know what happened, we trust our eyes, we can see who the villains are in this, and it was no need to sort of reinvestigate. And that just became, like the template for how stories were presented and sold to us, again and again and again in the next few years, and continues, no doubt, to this day, although I think there was a sort of glut at it. For a while, the Jesse Smollin's supposed hate crime thing was another one. Remember him? Jesse Smollin.
Yeah, I remember that.
He clearly paid two black guys to sort of pretend to beat him. I mean, it was just absolutely enraging. This kind of people constantly trying to create division and anger and stress and tension, And then the editor of the news, deputy editor George Eastman, got Roger Scruton thrown out of the government by misquoting him or selectively quoting him with great hostility to make him look like he'd been racist about the Chinese. Just terrible tactics by the left, again and again and again, supported by huge media, legacy media organizations. And after a while, you just think this is an absolutely rigged game. It's just disgraceful. And this, again, exactly why I say, suddenly I started to understand why people have said, enough, we'll have Trump.
Yeah, well, it does seem that, like, you can say what you want about Trump, but he does seem to be this kind of nuclear option for people who are like fed up with
He's not been a good president, although I will say I don't think he's been anything like the disaster they thought he was going to be, or like they presented him as being. I mean, most people, when he came in, were like, oh my God, I can't believe you're going to give him access to the nuclear codes. I have felt far less like we're about to charge into nuclear war than I did under George W. Bush, or certainly than I would have done under Hillary Clinton, for that matter, either. He's diffused a number of international situations. Obviously, he made great progress in the Middle East, to be honest, and everything's been calmer then than it was under Obama, which is, remember, the whole Syrian war thing kicked off under Obama, and then under George W. Bush, he opens a war on two fronts. Yes, after 9/11, which obviously was, came out of nowhere, and you can understand overreacting to it, but the Iraq war was an absolute catastrophe. There's been nothing like that scale of bad news under Trump. And yet, nowadays, you hear from George W. Bush, he's like an elder statesman who's invited to sort of, offer some calm and conciliatory words to a world that has been roughed up by Donald Trump's vulgar, style. I don't buy it at all. But he was never intended to be like a great administration. He was like throwing a stink bomb into the place, really, and I think he's worked on that. I'd be very surprised if he gets a second term, and I don't think it would be appropriate, really, if he were to. But he has certainly achieved some of his objectives, and I just hope well, I say that, and yet you look at what the Democrats have chosen to oppose him with, you know, a 78-year-old man who first to the presidency in 1988. He was like, he lost his grace on that occasion because he was found to be pilfering speech notes from Neil Kinnock. I don't know if many of you can remember Neil Kinnock. He was leader of the Labour Party before Tony Blair. I mean, you know, this is absurd that they've had 4 years to come up with a really solid, sound, ideally you would say young, vigorous, properly progressive, intelligent, inventive, and like, you know, somebody in his prime or her prime. And instead you've got this 78-year-old man who's quite clearly slipping away, you know, even before he's been elected. Very, very poor state of affairs.
The state of affairs, something I find quite funny is the Spitting Image has been brought back just recently, the puppet show Spitting Image. And for people that don't know, like, Spitting Image was this sort of satirical puppet show where like political figures would just get absolutely lampooned on a sort of weekly basis. I just remember I quite like watching reruns of it, of Margaret Thatcher referring to the cabinet as vegetables, and John Major being painted perpetually grey, and things like that. And I just find it's really sort of indicative of the times that we live in, that's decided that now is its moment to come back. It's got enough material to kind of resurrect itself, I think.
Interesting to see it. I mean, I lived through the first Spitting Image. I used to watch it at university. I remember several sort of classic episodes, you know, and it was always constantly, it was convinced again that we were on the brink of nuclear war, that Reagan was going to plunge us into nuclear war. In reality, Reagan made the great decisive moves that ended that prospect for the time being. But, you know, you can't always expect satire to get it right. That's not entirely its job. It was very, but it is always with these things, you look back through rose-tinted glasses, it wasn't that funny week in, week out, to be truthful. You know, the line you remember about Margaret Thatcher in the restaurant, and what about the vegetables? Oh, they'll have what I'm having. You know, that was like a real highlight, you know, after. Yeah. And it wasn't that funny. What was funny was the puppets and the voices were great. It had a huge cast of amazing voice people. They were all on there. A lot of them got their start on there. Harry Enfield, Steve Coogan, John Coleshaw, Alistair McGowan. They were all voices on that show, among several others as well. And it was tremendously barbed and disrespectful, you know. But it gets hard, of course, with every new iteration of comedy. You know, you're expected to be that much more disrespectful. I mean, just how disrespectful can you get? And of course, a lot of young people now, I don't know about yourselves, but a lot of young people now feel actually slightly sympathetic towards celebrities. I mean, you look at Meghan Markle, for instance, who I personally think has been a disaster in almost every important regard, you know, for the royal family generally, for Prince Harry, for the idea of royalty having some sort of meaningful role to play in the country. But, you know, I'm certainly open to other views. But what is interesting is that I think a lot of young people think of her as having been treated by a racist press. They think she's been subject to prejudice and hatred and vitriol. And, you know, there's a kind of, the people are against her for being black, which, you know, to me is nonsense. You know, the problems with her all come from her having ideas of celebrity that were rooted in her experience in Hollywood rather than what we expect of people who are in the royal family. But that's just one example. You know, there are a lot of people like that now in the public eye who Spitting Image in the 1980s would have just absolutely torn limb from limb. But now you have to be slightly more careful, because it might well be that, you know, people feel sorry for them and or feel, you know, wounded on their behalf. You know, leave them alone. You know. Yeah. So.
I'm very conscious. We've been talking for about 45 minutes now. So if you don't mind, I think I'll open this up to the other people to maybe ask you a few questions.
I noticed there's chat as well. Do you want me to answer any of the things on chat, or is that?
I think I'll just ask anyone who has something they've written in the chat and they wanted to ask you directly. I'll just get them to sort of unmute and they can have at it. So yeah, again, guys, if you've been here before, if you haven't, you've got those little emojis like the yes, no, hands up, and all that kind of business in the participants tab on the chat. So if you just put a hand up, then I'll get to you and I'll unmute you. So first up, we got Sam.
Hello. Very big fan of yours, Simon, as I'm an aspiring comic myself.
Thank you.
I was at one point the leader of the Comedy Society on campus. Unfortunately, it died because COVID happened, but an attempt was made. So two quick questions I'd like to ask you. One, what work are you more proud of, Melvin Turpin or Old Speckled Henry?
Melvin
Turpin from the Rich Hall cowboy show, or being Old Speckled Henry, or being
Well, as you probably guessed by the fact that I remember one name and not the other. Do you know what? I was genuinely very proud of those Old Speckled Hen ads. They were really rewarding to work on. I did write them as well, which was unusual. I think a lot of times you get asked to do an ad, you take the money. It's often very good money, and it was then. But usually, like a copywriter, as you know, they've been cooked up by a committee. But I was allowed a certain degree of creative input into those. Look, the puppet was amazing. It was operated by two separate individuals at the same time. It was really quite sophisticated. They had one for his sort of arms and legs, and another one who did all his eyebrows and his mouth and his snout and his ears moving backwards and forwards. And they actually shot them in real time in a pub. We set up in a pub. It was in Hampton Court, if I remember rightly. And he would sit at the bar, and I was sort of just out of shot doing the voice for him. It was all sort of done in real time. And I just found that really good fun. And I was sorry they stopped them, to be honest. I would have loved to have carried on having that sort of association, having grown up with Basil Brush and so on. So I was very proud of those. And I'm glad to see they're still on YouTube. Old Speckled Henry, you can still catch up with his finest hours. One of these days, he's due a comeback, I reckon.
Mm. And what present BBC comedian do you find the most insufferable?
Oh, God. You can probably guess, to be honest, but I'm not going to say his name because...
Is it Nish Kumar?
I'm just going to laugh.
Thank you very much, Simon.
You're welcome. Good luck with it, Sam.
Thank you.
Okie dokie. Anyone else? Anyone else? Just put your little hands up in the chat. Anybody else?
Rahman appears to have made it home, and he was in a car earlier, so I think he deserves to have a go.
Yeah, Sam, did you want to? I can't tell if he's saying yes or not, but...
Yeah, he's saying yes, yeah.
Okay. There you go.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. So you talked about kind of woke, I think, distracting us from capitalist inequalities.
Yeah.
Which party do you think represents those kind of views out of Labour and Conservative?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, Labour is obviously repositioning itself at the moment quite significantly. It was in the hand of a really quite radical minority, under Corbyn, and I think it's re-centering itself. And it's going to be quite interesting where it ends up. And it might very well end up somewhere that I'm quite comfortable with. I haven't felt comfortable voting Labour for a long time. I'm not a tribal politician kind of guy, but I could quite easily imagine that. I think the Tory Party probably do represent quite, they mirror to some extent what I was talking about, woke capital, that determination that we will appear to be in tune with your sensibilities and in the hope that you don't notice that you're being shafted, economically. I think they probably do run parallel to that to some large degree now as well. Yeah. So I would say that was a Tory party position. Other people who are more emphatically conservative than me have been saying for some time the Tory party is not remotely conservative in the traditional sense. It has no interest in conserving traditional values or in espousing them or justifying them or protecting or defending them or making a case for them. It is simply an administrative, opportunist, managerial class who are basically making the country safe for capitalism. And that isn't really what conservatism should be or used to be. It used to be about, you know, a social contract, you know, one country, one nation conservatism, as it was called, was about making the country good and fit and whole for everyone to enjoy, regardless of the prospects you started out with in life and so on. Conservatives should be able to have an offer that you can at least, you know, consider before you decide whether or not you would rather look at some more decisive and proactive redistribution. So I would say yes, the Tory Party do represent that tendency at the moment, and I don't say that with any great enthusiasm for them.
Thanks. Also,
what I would like to add, sorry, is that I don't know if you've probably seen it, but there's like instead of right and left wing now, there's a political grid thing where you kind of get the 4 quadrants, you know, and there's like the authoritarian, libertarian thing, and then left and right economically. And quite, I think, intelligent analysis has said that it's the top left-hand corner of that which has felt abandoned for the last few years, which is to say economically left but socially conservative. Basically, your old blue-collar worker who comes home in the evening and tells his daughter she's not going out dressed like that. You know, it's that kind of attitude, you know, and they say, save the NHS, back to the paedophiles, you know, that kind of thing. And they have felt abandoned, and they made their voice known with Brexit, probably. That was probably the people who had not really had a voice for long. That's who Labour need to get back if Labour were going to become an electable proposition again. And I think that they had been abandoned completely by Jeremy Corbyn. I think they thought he was absolutely wacko. He may well have been misrepresented by the media to some extent, but you can't completely ignore the fact that John McDonnell waved a copy of the Little Red Book around in Parliament. I mean, you know, if you're going to try and reassure people that you don't have some hard left agenda, that's not a very good start. But now we have, I think, Starmer is a pretty solid individual, not exactly exciting, not charismatic, but he's certainly intelligent. And I think there will pretty soon be opportunities, you know, to land some significant body blows on the government as their economic policies begin to bear very bruised fruit in the foreseeable future.
Okay, I think that's the political view I had, but I think I have no response to that, so I'm just going to agree with you and go back to you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, so anyone else, just shove your little hands up in the chat. In the meantime, I might just ask you a question myself on a similar topic to that. It's like, what do you think of the new Conservative government's job since it's been elected? So obviously we've had COVID and everything, which has been entirely unprecedented. But I was wondering if you thought they'd done a decent job, or.
I was initially, when they came in and they announced that very generous sort of Keynesian type budget with lots of incentives to convince the people who had broken rank in the red wall and so on that they'd done the right thing. I thought it was going to be very promising. I thought that they were going to wrong foot a lot of people who had written them off as a hard right party that were intent on a no-deal Brexit in order to shore up business interests and so on. I was quite encouraged. But I have not been very impressed, I'm afraid, with the way they've handled COVID. No, I completely understand the first month or 2 months or even 3 months of confusion and, as you say, an unprecedented situation during which time you have to try and protect people at all costs. The precautionary principle must take priority, and you have to try and analyse, the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate, and what might be the mitigating factors and what might be the comorbidities that increase, all these kind of, and you're looking at population density, and you're looking at different lifestyle choices, and you've got different subcultures and so on who are more or less capable of or inclined to obey lockdown and all the rest of it. A lot of data to crunch. But there comes a point where you have to say, right, now you've had enough time to work out what's going on now, and you need to get to grips with the situation and make life livable for us. And they've just completely failed to do so. I just have no confidence whatsoever in their strategy. I don't think they have any idea where they're going. I think they're just I feel very much like we're a nation that's just floundering at sea and hoping a helicopter shows up soon. And that's not good enough, you know, from the fifth largest, sixth largest economy in the world, with an extraordinarily docile and well-behaved populace who are not given to rioting in the streets, you know, who are not given to anti-governmental action and so on, who are generally speaking inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to their authorities. They've been really badly let down. And I feel now in particular that young people are being absolutely shafted, that the economy is being thrown under the bus in order to add a couple of years to the life of people in their 70s and 80s who are, I'm sorry, but they've had their go. You know, that is there every so often you will get something like a flu or some sort of pandemic or epidemic that will, you know, just wipe out. It will be a hard frost. It will be a bad flu year. And you will lose, you know, instead of, I mean, we lose 600,000 people every year. That's the standard death toll. 600,000 people, 1% of the population always die, obviously. At least 1% of the population have to die. You know, otherwise the country would just fill up, you know. Mortality is something we have to confront and accept. But you cannot just endlessly like close things down, and like even if there weren't lockdown law now, people have totally lost confidence in continuing getting back to work and getting back to normal life. Whereas the reality is, if you're under 60 years of age, certainly, and not terribly obese or with, you know, with one of those, I'm not like making moral judgments about obesity. If you are obese, then you're in a more serious situation, and you probably need to self-isolate to some extent. And there are one or two other things like asthma and so on. But, you know, you cannot completely hobble an entire nation, an entire economy indefinitely waiting for some vaccine, which may never turn up, very probably won't. You know, my wife works on the vaccine task force publicity, and it's understood within that group that you're looking for a vaccine that will help to protect the elderly. You're not looking at something that is going to eliminate this disease forever. This is not going to be like polio. This is going to be more like the flu vaccines you take every year that hope that they will provide some degree of immunity. We have a new disease. We're going to have to learn to live with it. But we, you know, you walk around Piccadilly Circus now, and it's like 28 days later. It's terrifying. That's really much more scary than any, you know, vulnerability most people under the age of 60 have to actually dying from this thing. And that's been a real letdown. And to say that that is a conservative, and I had always thought moderately libertarian leadership with Boris Johnson, I'm very disappointed indeed, I'm afraid.
Do you think that was an attempt of them to try and sort of appeal to, or were they kind of scared of the reaction to COVID? Everyone was instantly very kind of sort of hot on it. It seemed like everyone was very kind of, once lots of people started getting infected, everyone was like, you have to buy a mask, you have to sanitize your hands, and all this kind of business. Do you think that was very much a kind of, the government's response to that was to look like the ones that were doing the most to try and help them?
Well, that is always a problem with politics now, is it's very much about, you know, messaging and framing and all the rest of it, rather than the actual action. I think we had two problems. One is that there was a lot of misinformation came out early, both from the WHO. I think China very arguably deliberately misled the world on a number of important footings. I cannot understand how they had footage of people falling over and dying in the street. I mean, it's just absurd. You know, there's no evidence that would be absolutely something that would happen under the coronavirus as we now understand it. Obviously, America's response captured the world's interest, and then various other countries had different responses, which may or may not have been available to us. But probably the thing that defined, I mean, for instance, the mask thing, which you mentioned, which we were told repeatedly early on that masks had no effect whatsoever. I read loads of things online. I think online, you know, anonymous Twitter accounts were often far more well-informed and interesting and incisive and analytical than the official line that you got from the NHS. And people are saying, no, masks will help, actually, if everyone wears a mask, because they mainly protect the world from you rather than vice versa. It has to be reciprocal. You won't save yourself by wearing a mask, but if everyone goes out wearing a mask, we could just carry on as normal, effectively. If you just wear a mask and carry on as normal, we will probably all be fine. I mean, some people will catch it. It will work its way slowly through. But the initial idea was to flatten the curve and not overwhelm the NHS, not overwhelm the lack of ventilators and so on that we had. The whole point was never to make sure nobody ever got it ever, and we just stayed in our bunkers until it went away. The point was to limit the sudden surge of cases which might have overwhelmed the health service. Well, there's never been any close. We've not even come remotely close. They built all these Nightingale hospitals. They've never even been used. Most of them have lain completely empty. It's an absolute absurdity. And that problem has been exacerbated by the, as I say, lack of strategy and lack of any sort of forward planning or any sort of overarching narrative. And the other problem we have, I'm afraid, in this country, and we have had for years, of course, is an absurdly sentimental attitude towards the NHS, which the Tory Party know that they are suspected of wanting to privatise the NHS or break it up or run it down or turn it over into semi-privatised hands or otherwise corrupt its great unalloyed status as a national treasure and a virtually sort of like a secular religion. And so they had to really emphasise that they were guardians, safe guardians of the NHS. And so we have to protect the NHS. The NHS is an organisation of health workers who are there for our benefit. We pay handsomely for it, and we are entitled to expect them to provide a service. They are not like fucking, dinner ladies. This is like this is supposed to be our actual health service. A significant part of our GDP goes there. The idea that we have to protect it like it's some sort of wounded puppy or something has been really, really destructive, I think, in terms of how we've approached this whole thing. And attempting to play into people's inclination not to make night nurses have to work night shifts or whatever by getting ill. You cannot destroy an entire economy for a generation just to protect the NHS.
What if there is sort of one issue right now that you think is the most important that's facing society? What would you think that would be?
Well, funny enough, they asked you that on the trigonometry podcast, which I did recently, and my answer usually is demographic change, which we're not addressing, because we feel it's kind of impertinent to do so. But I would say, for instance, I mean, these figures are there, you can read them, but for instance, the two ends of life, birth and death, are massively out of whack. People are no longer having children. We have basically eliminated most of the societal pressures that encourage people to have children, the societal norms, whether they be to do with contraception and abortion, or whether they simply be to do with the expectation that you do get married and have children because that's kind of normal, and if you don't, you'll be somehow sort of excluded from polite society. That's gone the other way, if anything. Now most people feel that it's a real worry that if you were to get married and have children, your life is over and you are the one who's excluded from all the other people who are having fun. And at the other end, people aren't dying. People live longer and longer and longer. And unfortunately, the long tail at that end of life is not characterized by extreme good health. Instead, people live longer but require care, often 24-hour care, often one-on-one care. They have dementia or they have serious sort of physical insecurity and instability, which means that they need help to perform, the most basic daily functions. And a society cannot go on indefinitely with that kind of dynamic involved. Obviously, a degree of immigration is coping to some extent with the lack of young people coming into the job force that's been caused by the lack of babies being born. And, care homes are set up at the other end, which are providing some sort of cover for the elderly. But neither of these things are sustainable in the long run because, those people who come into the workforce will themselves have fewer children and go on and live longer lives as well. So we have to worry about that. We have to consider what our options might be. My personal solution to it, to be honest, would be to do everything we can to encourage people to live in such a way that their long tail, their last 20 years post-retirement, will at least be healthy and productive. It is possible. I mean, I've taken certain measures myself recently. I've virtually given up carbohydrates in my diet, and I feel a hell of a lot better for that. All I eat now is essentially protein and fat and greens. And I will tell you, if I had one piece of advice to anyone, it's to follow that. I've lost over a stone in the last month. I feel a lot more alert. I no longer need an afternoon nap. And I would imagine all kind of metrics that would measure my sort of, real biological age have improved as a result. But that's the kind of thing, if you've got people just getting diabetic and all the rest of it as they get older and they're weaker and they retire at 67 and then have 20 years of just sitting staring at a TV screen in their home, society is going to struggle to maintain its productivity and its forward thrust. And I think those issues need addressing, and we can't afford to be too gentle with people on that front.
Right. That's a unique one. No, not many people actually talk about that. I think you're right. I've been very greedy.
Nobody likes to acknowledge that Granny is a drain on the state. You know, obviously she's not. She deserves to have a nice long life. But the truth is, you know, in en masse, this unbalances the situation.
Right. Well, I'm conscious I've just been very greedy with my questions. I've just asked like 3 in a row, and it was supposed to be a Q&A time. So once again, if anyone else has any questions, please do let me know. You can put a message in the chat and I'll see it, or you can use your little emoji sticker thingies.
Hang on.
There we go.
Spent years spreading out falsehoods about Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh,
Stephen, yeah, he's right here. He just wants to speak.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Yep. We were just talking about that in the group chat, but I wasn't actually going to ask a question about Jeremy Corbyn, if that's okay.
No, sure. Go ahead.
Someone else probably will. Basically, I wanted to go back to the original topic about like comedy and free speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone in this chat would probably agree, like, you should not be arrested for jokes. I think that's just a given. The thing with like, when a lot of comedians like who sort of lean towards the right, and I'm not like talking about you specifically, I just mean like from what I've seen, and they'll claim like that like there's a problem with free speech in comedy and that they're being silenced or whatever. I think in a lot of cases, like can just be like people criticizing someone for like punching down rather than punching up. And obviously, like, as a comedian, I think you have the freedom to say whatever the hell you want. And I actually do wish there was a lot more comedians on the left who were willing to sort of push the envelope and be a bit more edgy. But yeah, I think it's just like, it just seems to me like it's more that, it's more of a case of being critical of like these comedians rather than actually going to a point and wanting to say like, no, you should not be allowed to speak. It's more just saying like, the jokes you're making, like, they're not really, they're just sort of punching down. Like they're sort of targeting, you know, groups of people where you could actually just be like, you know, punching up and actually targeting people who deserve it, like, you know, the sort of government or the monarchy. Actually, you made the point with that Frankie Ball joke about the Queen. I think that was a good example of like very edgy humor that is sort of, you know, punching up at like an established, cherished figure who has a lot of power. But I'm interested to know what you think of that, if you disagree or whatever.
I think the punching up, punching down thing has become common currency in this conversation without people really thinking hard enough about what that means. I understand the principle. I think it was Chris Rock, wasn't it, who first described it in those terms. But you have to, I mean, I'd have at least 2 things to say. And one of them is that I think a decent comedian, and certainly a decent comedy program, sees punching in all directions. You always want to see a boxing match. You know, you want to see punches thrown left, right, and center and back at you as well. As a comedian, you need to be getting hit yourself. You know, there needs to be self-deprecating humor. Otherwise, you just come across as arrogant. But there are lots of different ways in which somebody can be dynamically above or below somebody else. It's not simply a question of the amount of power you feel that position has in society. There are a lot of high status opinions which aren't necessarily held by people who have huge amounts of money or let alone sort of, you know, statutory power like the Queen has or something. And for instance, my father, who, as I say, is 88 and retired and on a state pension and lives in very humble circumstances and feels that his views, which is to say that we should leave the European Union, were mocked relentlessly on BBC topical comedy shows. He doesn't feel like that's punching up. He doesn't feel like he's higher status than those people. He's an old man with back pain who worked very hard all his life, read newspapers, has you know, maintained a degree of engagement with the world, and is entitled to his view and his vote. And he is being told by some guy who's got a wristwatch worth more than my dad's car, you know, that he's a racist old bigot for holding those views. Well, that isn't punching up in my book. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in that scenario, I would agree with you.
There's a lot of that in left-wing comedy. There's a lot of the idea that because you're sort of speaking on behalf of marginalized people or whatever, that you are, you know, like some kind of freedom fighter. You know, George Carlin is very good on this. He wasn't the funniest comedian in my view, but he was very good on things like political correctness and, you know, the incipient fascism of telling you what you could and couldn't think and what were the accepted and received views that were okay to share. And the truth is, comedy really is a much more visceral and timeless thing than punching up or punching down suggests. Yes, the ancient gesture, the fool in Lear telling truth to power, that's an important part of it. But the whack of comedy is that you say something that acknowledges a truth which is not easily acknowledged in polite company, and the impact of that being suddenly said unexpectedly is why it's called a punchline. It is a punch in the gut. You laugh. You laugh. That's what a real laugh is. Can't believe he said that. If you start hemming that in on all sides with your, you know, punching up, punching down calculations, everyone becomes too self-conscious to laugh. There's a comedy club in East London, in Bethnal Green, called Comedy Unleashed, which is connected, funnily enough, with Constantine, who does the trigonometry podcast as well, and a few other people who are of this kind of slightly skeptical view. And their thing there is all bets are off. You can do jokes about whatever you want. Now, the truth is there are no other comedy clubs that I know of a different size who don't have that rule, who say, no, you can't do jokes about this. But the very fact that they emphatically endorse that notion just seems to have a really galvanizing effect on the atmosphere. I've been there 4 or 5 times and performed there twice, and I've never heard a joke that you wouldn't have been able to do in any of the other comedy clubs. You know, it's not like people are taking the opportunity to do loads of racist shit or, you know, I don't know, like Nazi pug material. It's just, it's kind of like we're all, you know, we're off the leash. What goes on stays here, you know, that kind of thing. That's actually all people want. Comedy is a really cathartic, healthy experience. If you sit in a room with a load of other people all laughing and admitting that this is all a fiasco, it's all a, you know, it's a 3-clown circus. The whole world is, it always has been. We are all absurd little individuals, little jumped up twits, you know, running around with our plans. You know, he who would make the gods laugh tells them their plans. That's what comedy is at the end of the day. It's the gap between our aspirations and our reality. It's nothing to do with, you know, whether or not you're. And to be honest, making a joke about an 87-year-old woman's vagina is not punching up. I'm sorry, but it just isn't.
What I was gonna say earlier was about you making a comment about your dad and like. Sort of, just for lack of like a better term, like the comedians who are very like vocally anti-Brexit. I would sort of actually agree with you in the sense that there are a lot of like liberal comedians who they're very focused on, they're not very focused basically on, you know, solving like heavy economic issues. And I mean, I was saying in the chat basically, like you can focus on economic issues and you know, issues to do with like race, gender, sexuality, and all that. Both of those I think are very important things, but like that's the point, is both of them are. If you're a comedian and you're sort of saying like, oh, these just as an example, like people who, you know, throw around the term redneck, and they're describing you know, Trump supporters in the South and saying like, oh, these people are uneducated and stupid and all that. I would consider that, like, you could consider that to be like a very sort of like classist statement, and it doesn't really like look at the, you know, the actual reasons why people voted for someone like Trump, because, you know, they were, you know, maybe they'd been laid off their job or whatever, and, you know, the current government back then just hadn't really done anything to help them in that time.
You know, to interrupt, but it's very interesting, our perception of, I mean, Trump obviously benefited from some marginal voters of that kind who had voted for Obama in the previous 2 elections, incidentally. He attracted also a lot of people who were just disgruntled with mainstream politicians generally, and Obama was seen as an outsider who might break things up. But it's also worth bearing in mind that if only white men voted in America, every single state would be red. Every single state would be Republican if only white men voted. And that's regardless of the candidate. That would have been under Bush, that would have been under Romney, that would have been under any of the Republican candidates. American white men are, regardless of whether they've lost their job or whether they're the CEO of Google, they are overwhelmingly Republican. So we see it in this country. I think we see Trump as some kind of extraordinary aberration who is, inexplicably sort of, the reality is he's the default choice for an overwhelmingly large number of men in America, regardless of their economic anxiety or indeed their racism. We have to always remember that the center in this country is quite significantly to the left of the center in America. The Tory Party in this country would basically map onto the Democrats in America. That we've never had anyone who's as right wing as Bush or Reagan, not even Thatcher, economically.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I would agree with that. I think a sort of important distinction, basically, that a lot of people haven't really talked about is the difference, say, between being like on the left and being sort of, more of a moderate. People consider Hillary Clinton, people from the Republicans, they consider someone like Joe Biden to be like a leftist. And I think that's a really
be a leftist, but I think it's quite plausible that he won't last a term. And I think Kamala Harris is probably quite left. But guys, I'm really sorry, but I'm just hearing noises off, and I think the family are about to come in. I think it's probably fair to wrap it up there. We've done about an hour and a half. Would that be all right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's fine. I was about to do the same thing, actually.
Sorry to cut you off, Chief.
No, it's okay. Don't worry. Thank you so much for coming. I've really enjoyed it. It's been brilliant.
Absolutely welcome. Are you going to put it on YouTube or anything? Or do you
Yes, I think we will. We'll put it on YouTube.
If you do, let me know either by email or Twitter, and I'll share that as well, obviously, and do what I can to, stoke up viewers.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Not at all. Great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. And I sincerely hope that the present nonsense blows over as soon as possible and things get back to normal and you enjoy the rest of your cherished moments.
Thank you very much. So do we.
All right. Take care. All the best.
Take care. Bye.